The title of this week's lecture is Scripture, or the Bible. In 1862, F.D. Morris read the first volume of J.W. Colenso's book, The Pentateuch and Book of Joshua, critically examined, which had just been published. And Morris was devastated by what he read. Now, the two men were, in fact, close friends. Colenso had much admired Morris's book, The Kingdom of Christ, and Morris had officiated at Colenso's wedding in 1846. He much admired Colenso's work as a missionary bishop to the Zulu in the British colony of Natal in South Africa. Colenso had not only converted many Zulu to Christianity, he had written a dictionary and grammar of Zulu, had translated the Bible into Zulu. He'd begun to instruct his converts to teach the Christian faith to their fellow tribesmen. He was undoubtedly one of the greatest missionary bishops of his time. Why, then, was Morris so distressed when he read Colenso's book? Colenso had attacked the way in which the Bible described the Israelite crossing of the Red Sea and the subsequent wilderness wanderings. The book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 37, says that 600,000 male Israelites left Egypt at the time of the Exodus. However, if there were 600,000 men, the total population must have been around 2 million. Yet, according to the Bible, only 70 Israelites had gone down into Egypt 4 generations previously. How had they become so numerous in so short a time? The 2 million people, together with their sheep and cattle and carts, would have taken up an enormous amount of space. And as they journeyed towards the Red Sea, the column would have been some 22 miles long, so that the last of the party could not have started the crossing until the front had advanced 22 miles, something that would have taken probably at least 2 days. There were many other difficulties attending the account in the Bible. For example, there was said to be only 3 priests at the time. This being so, they would have had to slaughter the lambs at the time of the Passover at the rate of about 1,000 a minute. And when they presented the offerings required for newborn children, they would have needed to work for about 42 hours a day. Now, Colenso was not the first person to discover these difficulties with the text as taken literally. They had been long recognized, and Orthodox scholars had found ways of defending the text. But Colenso was not prepared to accept the unconvincing and special pleading which was required for the defense of the biblical text. And he felt obliged to say that the text could not be true at the level of credible history. Again, he was not the first person to say this, but what scandalized the English establishment of his day was the fact that he was an Anglican bishop, for whom such ideas were unforgivable. Why did Colenso do this? He tells us in his own words, now I quote, "While translating the story of the flood, I have had a simple-minded but intelligent native, one with the docility of a child but the reasoning powers of a mature age, look up and ask, is all that true? Do you really believe that all this happened thus? That all the beasts and birds and creeping things upon the earth, large and small, from hot countries and cold, came thus by pairs and entered into the ark with Noah? And did Noah gather food for them all, for the beasts and birds of prey, as well as the rest? My heart answered in the words of the prophet, shall a man speak lies in the name of the Lord? I dared not do so. My own knowledge of some branches of science of geology in particular had been much increased since I left England. And I now knew for certain, on geological grounds, a fact of which I had only had misgivings before, that a universal deluge, such as the Bible manifestly speaks of, could not possibly have taken place in the way described in the book of Genesis, not to mention other difficulties which the story contains. I felt that I dared not, as a servant of the God of truth, urge my brother man to believe that which I did not myself believe, which I knew to be untrue as a matter-of-fact historical narrative. I gave him, however, such a reply as satisfied him for the time, but I was thus driven, against my will at first, I may truly say, to search more deeply into these questions. End of quote from Colenso. In the first volume of his investigations, Colenso did not deal with the flood and Noah's Ark, the narrative that had sparked off his study of biblical criticism. This came in the second part of volume 4, several years later. And Colenso was devastating in his exposure of the implications of the story as taken literally. He pictured how the ark was inhabited with snails and insects, as well as animals, not forgetting insects that do not normally go in pairs, such as bees. He described the life of Noah and his family keeping animals such as lions well away from their normal prey, such as sheep, but needing additional animals in order to feed the carnivores. He pictured Noah and his family renewing the litter of the animals and disposing of their excrement. He wondered how, after the ark had grounded on Mount Ararat, the flightless dodo had got to the island of Mauritius, or the kangaroo had reached Australia. For Morris, all this was devastating. For him, the Old Testament was a true account of God's dealings with the Israelite people, an account that revealed what God was like and how he had established his government in the world through his dealings with the Israelite people. He felt that Colenso was attacking this belief and in the process undermining all that he, Morris, stood for. Charles Kingsley was similarly distressed by Colenso's views and published a book of sermons entitled The Gospel of the Pentateuch. And in the preface, without naming Colenso, he expressed his deep dissatisfaction. 150 years later, we know that Colenso was right and that Morris and Kingsley were mistaken in their opposition to him. And by 1862, Julius Hare and F.W. Robertson, the two people I mentioned last week in addition to Morris and Kingsley, they were both dead, so we do not know how they would have reacted. The question for a modern broad church is how we can accept the findings of biblical criticism while still maintaining the position of a man such as Morris, who drew such important consequences from the Bible for Christian faith and practice. The same question arises with regard to the New Testament. The critical study of the four Gospels has led some people to suggest that the interpretation of Jesus by the Church as the Son of God is incorrect, and that from the critical study of the Gospels we can discover the true historical Jesus rather than the Christ of faith which the Church has made him into. There have been several books by distinguished scholars that have tried to do precisely this, while at the level of what we might call the lunatic fringe, there have been books suggesting that Jesus married Mary Magdalene, had a family, and carried on living after the crucifixion. For the remainder of this lecture, I shall deal first of all with the Old Testament and how critical scholarship affects our understanding of it, before passing to a consideration of the Gospels as a witness to the life and ministry of Jesus. Since 1862, archaeological discoveries have transformed our knowledge of the ancient world in which the Old Testament was written. Texts from ancient Assyria and Babylon have shown us that the story of the flood in the Old Testament was commonly known in the ancient world. We now know much about the history of those great nations, Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria, that played such an important part in the history of Israel, and about which we knew previously only from the Old Testament and some classical sources. We also know that many of the laws in the book of Exodus can be paralleled from laws from ancient Babylonia and Assyria, and this, of course, was the subject of the Beauchief Abbey Lent lectures last year. Many of the great sites in ancient Israel have been excavated, such as Megiddo, Lachish, Samaria, Hatzor. Excavations in Jerusalem have been limited by the fact of its continued occupation, but such work as has been done has greatly contributed to our knowledge of its history. Archaeologists do not always agree, however. According to one school of thought, archaeology reveals that Jerusalem was not really occupied much before the time of David, and that the biblical account of the empire of David and Solomon has been somewhat exaggerated. Now, I've no time this evening to go into the disputes between the so-called minimalists, who don't find very much history in the Old Testament, and the so-called maximalists, who find as much as they can. My own view of the history of Israel is that a distinctive people, united by common religious beliefs, began to emerge sometime in the 10th to 9th centuries BC. A large part was played in this by prophetic groups who believed in a God they called Yahweh, who demanded social justice and that rulers should rule fairly and justly. Not everyone in the nation agreed, of course, and many of the people had recourse to popular beliefs and superstitions. In the early part of the 9th century, an able ruler named Omri established a powerful kingdom in the north of Israel, which dominated the region for 50 or so years. Omri and his descendants were bitterly opposed by the prophetic groups, who preserved some of the ancient traditions of the people. During this time, there was a smaller and weaker Israelite kingdom to the south named Judah, one of whose founding kings had been named David. Following the destruction of the northern kingdom in the year 721, the kingdom of Judah took over the role of Israel, and scribal and prophetic groups began to write down the ancient traditions of the two peoples. Judah was destroyed by the Babylonians in 597 and 587, and the king and the notable people of Judah were deported to Babylon. This tragedy led to deeper reflection on the part of the prophetic and priestly groups. It gave great stimulus to the writing down of the ancient traditions, including the prophetic books, the stories about the founding fathers, the exodus from Egypt, and the giving of the laws to Moses. What we call today the Old Testament began to take shape, and it reached something like its present and final form some 200 years before the birth of Jesus. Now, it has long been accepted that the Bible is not an up-to-date handbook on matters of science, astronomy, geography, and technology. The great reformer Calvin, and I presume nobody doubts his commitment to the Bible, commenting on Genesis chapter 1, which talks about the two great lights, i.e. the sun and the moon, and who was aware that the telescope had made it apparent that there were much bigger heavenly bodies in the universe than the moon, advised his readers that the biblical account described the universe only as it could be observed with the naked eye from earth. Quote, "He who would learn astronomy," said Calvin, "let him go elsewhere." It is a pity that those today who want to take Genesis literally do not study the history of biblical interpretation. If they did, they would discover that there have been many different ways of interpreting Genesis chapter 1, and certainly by scholars whose Christian commitment to the Bible could in no way be doubted. However, even some critical scholars who have been happy to accept that the Bible is not an accurate handbook on matters of geography, astronomy, and physics have been reluctant to accept that the same applies to its historical records. There have been a number of rearguard actions designed to protect the historical accuracy of the Old Testament. Today, critical scholarship speaks more in terms of cultural memory than history, and this is an important way of interpreting the Old Testament historical narratives correctly. The easiest way to understand cultural memory is to think in terms of a water filter. Now, here in Sheffield, with our splendid Yorkshire water, I don't think we need water filters. But I once visited a friend in Lincolnshire who filtered all his water before using it. You put the water into the top of the container and it trickles down to the bottom. And it passes through various layers of filters which remove impurities. Cultural memory is similar in the following way. Memories are passed down from generation to generation, and as they descend, they may be telescoped, while bad memories may be forgotten and good memories are retained. Part of the remembering process may be connected with religious celebrations and liturgical recitations, and this is certainly true of the story of the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, which are still commemorated yearly at Passover time by Jewish communities. What we have in the narratives of the Old Testament are filtered cultural memories. And the question arises how we are to interpret them. Now, in our discussion last week, I mentioned the important distinction between understanding and reason as formulated by Coleridge, and you'll hear much more about that next week if you come. I said that understanding was concerned with facts, while reason was concerned with meaning. If we take these concepts to the story of the Exodus, we have to say that from the standpoint of understanding, that is, as concerning facts, we can find many faults with the story and its arithmetic. If we ask the question, what does this story mean? We have to say that it contains the experience of many generations of Israelites, of their encounter with God, and their belief that God was guiding the affairs of their nation, both for salvation and for judgment. In the ethical teaching of the Old Testament, the Exodus story played an important role, as I showed in my lectures last year. The Israelites were constantly reminded that they were once slaves in the land of Egypt and that God redeemed them from slavery, and therefore it was necessary for them to deal graciously with each other in order to reflect how God had been gracious to them. If we understand the narrative parts of the Old Testament as cultural memory and approach them via reason, that is, asking what they mean, we get a different answer compared with treating them as matter of fact history to be read from the standpoint of understanding. I have on more than one occasion at the Abbey reminded you that it is remarkable that we have an Old Testament at all. Culturally, Israel and Judah were backward and undeveloped compared with the great civilizations of Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. If you go to the Near Eastern Museum in Berlin, you can see a reconstruction of the processional way of the goddess Ishtar in Babylon. using the original wonderful enameled bricks with their blue surface adorned by mythical figures in yellow and gold. This processional way dates from the time when the Israelites were in exile in Babylon, and it must have been a source of great amazement to them. Yet, it was not Egypt, Babylon, or Assyria that gave great ideas to the ancient world. These kingdoms disappeared, only to be rediscovered in the 19th century by the spades of the archaeologists. These kingdoms did not, like Israel and Judah, bequeath to the world what we call ethical monotheism, that belief in one God who demanded justice from and for all peoples. The preservation of the religious records, prophetic books, psalms and wisdom texts from ancient Israel over a period of 3,500 years is, to me, adequate proof that God was involved with that people and with the scriptures that they gave to the world. A modern broad church use of the Old Testament must welcome every aspect of biblical criticism, yet understand what is the exact nature of the material that the Old Testament contains and how it should be interpreted. The value of the Old Testament is that it is the witness of ordinary people facing many of the kinds of problems that we face today, and doing so with a deep awareness of the presence of God in their history and in their personal lives. This is one reason why texts such as the Psalms still have so much to say to us in situations of sickness, distress, and joy. To lose the Old Testament, either through ignorance or through an unwillingness to read it with the help of biblical criticism, is to lose a vital witness to the involvement of God in the world which he has created. I turn now to the New Testament and the question whether the Gospels truly represent that Jesus Christ in whom the church believes, or whether biblical criticism has shown that the church has from the beginning been mistaken about him. One writer has summarized the problem neatly as follows, I quote, "Christianity stands or falls by the historic figure of Jesus, yet the Christian conception of Jesus can never be demonstrated as the only possible interpretation of the evidence." If I can put that into sort of clearer language. I mean, the point is that the church's witnesses, it depends on the New Testament records. And yet, anybody who wants to can come along and read them quite differently and produce a completely different Jesus. And this is why attempts have been made to show that Jesus was some kind of social reformer or a type of wandering philosopher or simply a great teacher, but certainly not the Son of God. Now, in approaching this problem, I want to mention the work of a great Methodist New Testament scholar who for 15 years was my colleague and friend in Durham, and whose seminar on the New Testament I attended each week for those 15 years. His name was C.K. Barrett. He died in the August of 2011, and interestingly enough, in view of what we've been saying, he was given the names of Charles Kingsley Barrett, out of respect by his parents for that great churchman from whom we heard last week. In an essay in the Cambridge History of the Bible entitled "The Interpretation of the Old Testament in the New," Barrett examined all the ways in which the Old Testament was being used and interpreted by Jewish groups at the time of the ministry of Jesus. After an exhaustive examination, Barrett concluded that the way in which the Old Testament was used in the New Testament was without parallel at that time, and he concluded that there was only one possible explanation, I quote, The gospel story as a whole differs so markedly from current interpretation of the Old Testament, and by current he means then interpretation of the Old Testament, that it is impossible to believe that it originated simply in meditations on prophecy. It originated in the career of Jesus of Nazareth, end of quote. If I may add my own observations here, as an Old Testament specialist, and also one who has made an extensive study of Jewish traditions at the time of Jesus, the remarkable thing about the ministry of Jesus is that it is so unexpected. No one reading the Old Testament in the way it was being read in the time of Jesus could possibly have seen Jesus as the servant of God sent to suffer and to rise from the dead. That is why, as the gospel records show, his ministry produced so much misunderstanding. Not only was he misunderstood by the religious authorities of his day, he was misunderstood by his own disciples. When he began to teach them that he must be delivered to the Gentiles and must suffer at their hands, even his closest disciples refused to believe this. The reason why at the crucifixion the disciples deserted him was because they could not believe that what was happening was the will of God. It was only after his resurrection that they began to remember what he had taught them about his ministry and death. And they could begin to see that it was in fulfillment of the Scriptures, even though no one saw this at the time. This, together with a number of other considerations, leaves me in no doubt that the church did not, from the beginning, misunderstand Jesus, and that his real mission was quite different from what the church thought. At the end of his book entitled Jesus and the Gospel Tradition, Barrett made the following comment on the fact that Jesus wrongly seems to have expected the world to end shortly after the conclusion of his ministry. Barrett wrote, "By being mistaken in detail, Jesus was more effectively shown to be right in all that really mattered than he could have been by small-scale accuracy. At the same time, he was shown to be very man, subject to our infirmity. Perhaps this is why, not least when we study the Gospels with the most stringent historical discipline, he speaks to us as the Word of God in our speech." Just as the narrative traditions in the Old Testament are cultural memory, so the Gospels of the New Testament are cultural memory, having been filtered through the experiences of the first disciples following the great crisis of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and their conviction that he was indeed God's chosen servant for the salvation of his people and for the whole world. Just as we need to treat the cultural memories of the Old Testament from the standpoint of understanding and reason, so we have to treat the gospel records from the point of view of understanding and reason. When we do so, we discover, as Barrett says, that Jesus speaks to us as the Word of God in our speech. I want to end where I began, with Colenso's work on the Pentateuch. It must be remembered that Colenso was not a negative biblical critic. He was a missionary bishop, driven by a deep desire to teach the people among whom he worked of the love of God expressed in Jesus Christ. But he was driven to do what he did with biblical criticism because he believed himself to serve the God of truth. It is tragic that he was misunderstood, not only by the establishment of his day, which hated him deeply, but by his friends, Morris and Kingsley. He has been misunderstood frequently since. There is a widespread belief today, including in many churches, that anyone who practices biblical criticism must by definition be a non-believer or a disturber of the Christian faith. I hope that I have shown in this lecture that this is not the case, and that we have nothing to fear from biblical criticism. Indeed, I will go further and say that without biblical criticism, we cannot present Christianity as an intelligible, convincing, and practical faith for our generation. Now, I've often said in sermons here in the Abbey that no other great world religion has had its scriptures subjected to such searching academic criticism has been the case for the Bible. Similarly, no founder of a great religion has had his life subjected to such searching academic criticism as has Jesus. This is something that should give us pride and confidence. Yet I want to let Colenso have the last word in this lecture. At the end of part 6 of his great work on the Pentateuch, he wrote the following memorable words, I quote, "There is no infallible book for our guidance, as there is no infallible church or infallible man. The Father of spirits has not willed it thus, who knows best what is needed for the education of each individual soul as well as that of the race. But he gives us light enough upon our path that we may do our work here faithfully and fear no evil. And the pure in heart will see God face to face in many a page of the sacred book, will recognize the divine revelation of all that is good and true throughout it, will hear God's voice and feel his living word come home to the heart, and that it must be obeyed."